I visited Franklin Barbecue in Austin, Texas last month, and I finally had the chance to try Aaron Franklin's world-famous brisket. Now, I highly recommend you also make the pilgrimage to Franklin Barbecue to try it yourself, but there's no way in a million years you can tell me that there's only salt, pepper, and beef tallow used on that brisket. No way. It has at least one secret ingredient that no one is talking about, and maybe more. And I want to get to the bottom of it so you can make barbecue Jesus quality brisket at home. I'll be doing multiple videos on this topic, but in this video I'm going to explore a theory of whether they use monosodium glutamate, otherwise known as MSG, on Franklin brisket, and if that is one of the secret ingredients. So let's get smoking. The first part of this test I'll talk about is the most objective one. I obtained these MSG testing strips from a lab testing company. Basically, they will turn purple in the presence of glutamate, which is the main ingredient in MSG, besides just salt. Really, that's all MSG is. It's sodium, which is salt, and it's glutamate, which is an essential neurotransmitter that our body needs to function. The deeper the shade of purple on these test strips, the higher the concentration of glutamate there is in the sample being tested. I took some Franklin Barbecue brisket back to my hotel in Austin, and I removed a strip of bark from the fat cap of one of the slices. That's the area of the brisket that would most likely have MSG and other spices applied to it, and it's also pure fat, so it's less likely to pick up the naturally occurring glutamates in the muscle tissue of the brisket. The first test results were pretty clear. The test strip turned purple, which indicates the presence of glutamate in the brisket bark, so there was definitely glutamates on the brisket bark. I then did a few more tests on other areas of the brisket, which showed a bright purple reaction whenever I tested the fatty brisket bark, and a less purple reaction on other areas of the bark that were just kind of pure muscle tissue, spices, and smoke with no fat. For comparison, I tested other brisket slices from popular barbecue joints in Austin, including La Barbecue, Styles Switch, and Interstellar Barbecue. All of them reacted somewhat and turned a little bit purple, indicating the presence of glutamate, with the exception of Interstellar Barbecue, which barely reacted at all. And all of them were lighter purple in color than the Franklin Barbecue brisket, which indicates that those slices of brisket had less glutamate in the bark than the Franklin brisket. I also tested a brisket at home, which I knew had no MSG used on it at all, and its color was similar to the color of the Interstellar Barbecue test. It reacted to the presence of natural glutamate, probably in the muscle tissue or juices from the brisket, but it was very light in color, suggesting that the concentration of glutamate was very low. So this test showed that the concentration of glutamate in the Franklin Barbecue brisket bark was higher than the other briskets I tested, which could be explained by the use of MSG on the Franklin Barbecue brisket. But that isn't the end of the story, because there's a couple problems with this test that make it not so trustworthy. First of all, glutamate occurs naturally in a lot of different things, including mushrooms and tomatoes. So the presence of glutamate on a Franklin Barbecue brisket could be caused by just some of the juices from the meat that escaped from the brisket, which have glutamates and they got on the bark somehow. Or it could have been beef base or concentrated beef stock used on the brisket. Or it could have been mushroom powder or even soy sauce. Any one of these things could result in a higher concentration of glutamates detected by these test strips, so it doesn't necessarily mean that there's MSG used on the brisket. Second, I conducted these tests in a hotel room, not in a controlled lab environment, and while these test strips can detect the presence of MSG and the relative concentration just using the method that I did, I emailed the test strip provider and they emailed me back what you're actually supposed to do when you're testing a solid sample like brisket bark, and you're not just testing some sort of liquid like soup or milk. I'll read the exact steps that they sent me. Step 1, grind 0.2 grams of the sample. Step 2, homogenize with hydrochloric acid and 3 stainless steel balls in a mixer mill for 2 minutes. Okay. Step 3, centrifuge at 18,000 G for 15 minutes. And then step 4, neutralize the supernatant with NaOH before testing with the strips. Step 5, dilute the sample if necessary. Now, maybe I'll get a centrifuge and hydrochloric acid for my birthday, but as it stands right now, I did these tests in a hotel room as best I could, so take them with a grain of salt. Before we get to the second test, I want to thank ZBiotics for sponsoring this video. It's a probiotic drink that breaks down the byproduct of alcohol most responsible for rough mornings after drinking, and it helps me enjoy some drinks with friends and not feel terrible the next day. I just drink a bottle 30 minutes before having an alcoholic drink, and while I drink, it's working to break down that toxic byproduct in my gut that would otherwise prevent me from having the best day possible the next day. As we're now moving into the holiday season, I'm going to be using it more often. It just removes that extra layer of grogginess and lack of motivation that I usually get the next day after drinking, and it helps me feel more motivated, which is actually the number one benefit I get from it personally. And the best thing about it is if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't matter because they have a 100% money back guarantee, which is one of the big reasons that I like this brand and I promote it. They really stand behind their product. Now the holidays are upon us and ZBiotics makes a great gift. It's unique, it's thoughtful, and it's also under $40, which is great if you're like me and you're doing Secret Santa with your family and it has a dollar limit. Most of us are having more drinks this holiday season, so make sure to order today to get some ZBiotics in time. Go to zbiotics.com/SmokeTrailsBBQ and use my code SmokeTrailsBBQ at checkout to get 15% off your first order. All right, let's get back to the video. Moving on to the second test, my own taste buds. When I first tasted the brisket at Franklin Barbecue, the first thing that hit me was the extreme saltiness and fattiness of the brisket. The entire slice of brisket was almost as salty as I would expect at a barbecue competition where everything is oversalted. It was enough to make me kind of pucker up and say that that was too salty. But it wasn't. It was just below the level where I would consider something oversalted, and as a result, it was super tasty. The taste of the bark itself was not peppery at all, surprisingly. In fact, I could barely taste the pepper. It was very salt forward and had a bit of zing on the sides of my tongue, almost like the tartness of lemon or lime. But I couldn't really tell if it was an actual flavor that might have been added by something like MSG or lemon-infused salt or citric acid or something. It could have just been the extreme amount of salt that was making me think there were other flavors going on. In any event, the tasty, salty umami flavor was very apparent, and that's what made me think there might be some MSG in the bark. But again, the umami flavor could have just been from other glutamates on or inside the meat itself. Lastly, I tasted the fattiness of the brisket and the beef tallow coating the slices. It was a very thin, refined, oily taste, almost like melted butter without the intense butter flavor, or something like a neutral vegetable oil that had been added to the tallow. It definitely didn't taste like the straight tallow that I add to my briskets, which has an intense beef flavor and kind of a thicker mouthfeel. But more on that later. Now in this final test, I'm smoking a brisket with MSG on it and comparing it to my memory of how the Franklin brisket tasted. First, I rubbed the brisket on both sides with Franklin brisket rub that I bought from Franklin Barbecue. The ingredients just say salt and pepper, and they say no MSG. But that doesn't necessarily mean this is the exact rub they're using on their own brisket. It just means this is the rub they're selling to the public. I separated most of the salt and the pepper and found that it was around 70% salt to 30% pepper by volume. I wasn't able to get all the pepper removed from the salt, so being conservative, I would say it's somewhere between 50 and 70% salt by volume, which is an extreme amount of salt for a brisket rub. A lot of people even go 40% salt and 60% pepper because they find 50-50 is way too salty. And to make things even more salty in this brisket rub, the granules of salt they use are definitely not the size of regular kosher salt. They're much smaller and more akin to the size of table salt. Looking under the microscope, we can see the table salt is roughly 0.5 millimeters in diameter, while the salt used in the Franklin's brisket rub is slightly larger at 0.7 millimeters. But it's much smaller than kosher salt, which fills the entire microscope field of vision here at a diameter of roughly 2 millimeters, more than twice the size of the Franklin brisket salt. Because the salt that's used in the Franklin brisket rub is much smaller than kosher salt, that means it has more surface area and it's going to be much more salty on the tongue. And the last thing I noticed about the salt used in the Franklin's brisket rub is that it's slightly yellow. It doesn't have the bright white appearance of table salt. I'm not sure what the significance of this is. Maybe the salt used in Franklin's brisket rub is something like sea salt or infused salt or something with some mineral impurities in it, but it definitely is something other than pure salt, which is NaCl, and as a result, it has a little bit of a different flavor. Now, after the Franklin brisket rub is applied, I'm adding a layer of pure MSG. This is a popular brand of MSG called Accent that you can find in most grocery stores. Don't be fooled by the branding, it's literally just MSG. Now I'm placing the brisket on my offset smoker and I'm smoking it up to 190 degrees internal. Then I'm wrapping it in tallow-soaked butcher paper with a bit of extra frozen tallow under the brisket. And then it goes into a pan with half a cup of water. It's foiled tightly and it holds at 150 in my oven for 12 to 16 hours. After that, I'm flipping the brisket over to get the tallow fully soaking the top of the brisket. I'm not really sure if this is what they do at Franklin Barbecue. I saw the meat cutter at Franklin Barbecue go up to the holding oven. They took a brisket out with the paper and it was fully soaked through with some sort of oily liquid. They took it to the cutting board and they dumped out the brisket or unwrapped it and it just gushed out a ton of fluid. There was a lot of fluid in there, so you could tell that some fluid had been added. And it's widely believed that this is added tallow that they add when they wrap the brisket. Now, when they unwrap the brisket, the meat cutter slices the brisket slices, and she kind of got a bunch of tallow on her hand from the cutting board and then put the brisket on her hand on one side and then slapped it on another brisket slice that also had tallow on it. So all the slices were thoroughly coated in this tallow before they were put on the tray. So that's what I tried to do when I cut into this brisket. All right, let's take a cut into this. I'm just gonna slice it right down the center here. So far it's slicing like a dream. Give you guys a look inside. Look at that. Ooh, that is a thing of beauty. Look at all of that juice. I'm gonna slice off a little bit of the flat here. Oops, wow. Rookie move there. Do a better one for you guys. There we go. That's one. That's two. And one more. That's a three. Whew. That's floppy, looks nice. And I'm just gonna do some slices off of the point as well. And now I'm gonna do a quick taste test for you guys. Okay, let's try the flat first. Pulls apart nice and easily, that's a good sign. I'm gonna taste the bark. That's yummy. And now the point. Really good. Okay, I just finished tasting it, and the first thing I'll say is this doesn't taste anything like Franklin brisket. That's not necessarily a bad thing. What I like about this brisket is it's a lot more juicy because I finished it at a lower temperature. The Franklin brisket that I ate when I was in Austin, and I did a video on this that I'll link for you guys, the flat was a little bit drier than I tend to like because they typically take their briskets up to probably around 200 before they finish it. And I finished my briskets no higher than 190, and I think that's what accounted for the more juicy flat in this instance. The Franklin brisket had a really juicy point though. The one thing that I did notice, even leaving all of those things aside, is that this is not even close to as salty as the Franklin brisket was. And you guys saw how much of the salt and pepper rub, the Franklin brisket rub that I put on this brisket. It's still nowhere near, it doesn't even approach the amount of salt that was on the Franklin brisket. So they're doing something at Franklin's that involves putting a lot of salt on the brisket, maybe at different stages of the cooking process, I'm not sure, but at the very least, they're putting double the amount of rub on the brisket that you saw me put on, because this is not salty enough. And not just not salty enough on the bark, but not salty enough in the interior of the meat. I noticed in the Franklin brisket, when you ate the actual meat itself, even without any bark on it, it was still salty. So there's some salt in the tallow mixture of whatever they put in the tallow, whether it's tallow or a mixture of tallow and oil. There's probably salt added to that, or they let it sit in a salty solution as it sits overnight. There's something going on there because the meat was just super salty. And I even tried it the next day, the Franklin brisket, after I ate at Franklin's and just ate it for lunch as leftovers. And when I chewed on the meat, not even including the bark, it kept on producing salt in my mouth like I was sucking on a piece of beef jerky. It was extracting salt. It was like I was sucking on a piece of salty beef, which is really weird, and I've never experienced that with brisket before. So something's going on with the Franklin brisket. They're definitely putting a lot of salt in their rub. They may be doing something else. That's the second thing I noticed. The third thing I noticed is that I'm really tasting the MSG on the bark on this brisket. So what that tells me is that Franklin's, if they even do use MSG in their brisket or their rub, then they're definitely not using as much as you saw me put on this brisket. So if they are using MSG, it's definitely in a lot smaller quantities than this one. And the final thing that I noticed is that even soaking this stuff with the tallow solution that I had in there, it had water and tallow, a ton of tallow. You saw how much tallow I put in the wrap, and coating the slices, it still doesn't taste the same as the oil or tallow or mixture or whatever on the Franklin brisket. It doesn't have the greasiness that the Franklin brisket had. The Franklin brisket gave me the perception of like a greasy bag of like popcorn or something at the movie theater. It didn't taste buttery. It just tasted like it wasn't just beef fat. It was like oily, like vegetable oily. So that was kind of interesting. And that could have just been the way that I was perceiving it. And they're using really high quality rendered tallow or something, or a type of tallow that I don't use. But the whole oil experience on the outside of the brisket was different at Franklin's than this one. In conclusion, the Franklin brisket that I tested had a higher concentration of glutamates than any of the other briskets that I tested in Austin, including the control brisket that I tested at home, which I knew had no MSG added to it at all. The Franklin brisket also had a very umami flavor that didn't just taste like salt and pepper. That being said, many other ingredients, including the meat itself, could have accounted for the higher concentration of glutamates on the Franklin brisket. So I finished this video and I concluded that I wasn't really convinced that there was MSG on Franklin brisket, but it could still be a possibility. But that's kind of where my conscience got the better of me. In my opinion, MSG is completely safe and it's a legitimate ingredient to add in any cooking. But there are some fringe theories that are based on thoroughly debunked beliefs from decades ago that MSG is harmful to humans. I won't go over it in detail, but Adam Ragusa has a really excellent video on the topic that I suggest you watch if you're interested in it. I'll link it right here and in the description box below if you want to check it out. In any event, even though I believe that MSG is completely safe and it's a great ingredient to use in cooking, there's people out there that have different beliefs and they think it might be harmful. So those people might not go to Franklin Barbecue if they watch this video and they think that there's any possibility that there's MSG used in their food. And I don't want that. I'm not out here to hurt a legitimate business, especially one that I respect so much, just to get views or something like that. I just want to find out what ingredients are being used at the top barbecue restaurants in the world to make the best brisket in the world, so I can also make the best brisket in the world at home, and I can teach you guys how to make the best brisket in the world at home. So to be extra careful and courteous to Franklin Barbecue's business, I reached out to them with an email and I outlined my findings and asked them if they'd like to comment on it. I'll be honest, I fully was not expecting a reply at all, but to my great surprise, Stacy Franklin herself reached out to me, and this is what she said. She said, "I can say with 100% certainty that we do not add MSG to our seasonings for any of the meats or sides for that matter at the restaurant." So there you have it. Franklin Barbecue does not add MSG to their briskets. Now, I'm being a little bit cheeky here, but you could interpret her words to mean that they don't add any MSG, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not using ingredients like a seasoned salt that already has MSG in it. But I'm not really reading that much into it. I'm assuming that the intent of what she's saying is that there's no MSG on the brisket, period. So I think it's safe to say that there is no MSG used on Franklin brisket, and this myth is busted. So with MSG eliminated, what's next? Well, I think it's interesting to explore the extreme saltiness of Franklin brisket, how they get it so salty without being over-salted, what type of salt they're using, and most interesting to me, whether they're adding anything to their beef tallow, like a butter blend, vegetable oil, or something else that I haven't even heard of to thin out the oil and make it taste more clean and neutral and get closer to the taste that I tasted on that Franklin brisket that was unlike my briskets when I used straight tallow. But that's for another video. If you guys have eaten at Franklin Barbecue, I'm interested to hear what you think about it. Do you think they use any secret ingredients on their brisket, or do you think I'm just crazy and they're just using salt, pepper, and beef tallow? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you guys are interested in joining a community of other barbecue nerds like me and you're super into barbecue, then consider joining my Patreon. I'll link it in the description section below. The biggest benefit you'll get is early access to my videos, and you'll also get access to a private Discord chat server where you can contact me directly, get answers from me, and also talk to other people that are like-minded in the community. So I hope to see you there, and I'll definitely see you in the next video. Happy smoking.